So at a surface level, um, if you look at the flags of India before their independence in 1947, then you see the Union Jack everywhere. There's different forms of the flag, but essentially, India was under colonial rule for centuries. And that actually started back in 1600. But we have to take a step back here because, like I said in that previous video, I don't want to focus now on national contributions to climate change. I want to point to something more fundamental, and that's capitalism. Capitalism as the drive of climate change. Capitalism with its imperatives of growth and profit as the key to understanding why emissions keep accelerating. And the Indian story is informative for that. So chapter 6 in the Climate Academy textbook takes India as a case study because back in 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed an agreement, if you like, for the formation of what's known as the East India Company. And the East India Company was allowed to trade at the beginning in the outposts on the edges, on the fringes of India, on the coastal regions, and they set up these trading posts. But over time, the trade went very well. British people quite like tea. And those trading posts became more extensive. And in the end, there's this really crucial date, which is 1766. Now, if you're a student of history in England, certainly for me when I was growing up, 66 was always like a key date in history. 1066, the Battle of Hastings, 1666, the Great Fire of London, and of course, 1966, the England for once bringing football home. But this date, 1766, you won't find that in a British textbook. But actually, it's a critical year because Clive of India in the Battle of Plassey, this was a moment where this East India Company, rather than just kind of protect its little trading outposts and these, let's say these depots, it actually became, in a sense, in control of almost all of India. Like it took decisive control of the Indian economy, the Indian society. And so what you have now is not just like trade. This is trade with an army. So you could think like Google with guns or Amazon with ammunition. We're talking about a company essentially taking over a country. Now, this story, in a way, we're often distracted by the British flags. But back in Change Lane, that's the headquarters of the East India Company back in London, they were pulling the strings on policy, they were pulling the strings on exactly what happened in India. And what were they pulling the strings for? Well, they were pulling the strings in order to maximize their profit. They were pulling strings in order to maximize their economic growth. So we have a country, very, in a sense, explicitly, even has a flag. The East India Company had a flag. We have a company which is exploiting and extracting and doing all of its business in India for one singular purpose, and that is profit. And this, let's say, odd truth, okay, in the end, the British, there's trouble and there's rebellions and so on. And in the end, it does become a property of England. It becomes part of the British Empire. It becomes the British Raj. But in a way, that's just a distraction. What I want to point out here is that the matrix or the organizing algorithm for India, for those at that time, was explicitly profit. So if you actually zoom in on that wall behind me, you can actually see bullet holes in the wall for all these various, fights and skirmishes that took place here in Delhi. Now, this idea of Amazon with ammunition or Google with guns or whatever, let's just see how that plays out in terms of consequences. Well, the brutal fact is that under the British rule, because the British, of course, wanted to maintain the profits of the company, under British rule, there were famines in India in which the most extraordinary suffering took place. And let's just go in the student textbook, the details are given, but essentially in the famine of 1876 to 1878, this happened in the Deccan Plateau. This is called the Great Famine. And just like World War I was great, this was an equally great famine in that approximately 6 to 10 million people died. Now, in this famine, which covered an area of around 670,000 square kilometers, of which Delhi here was kind of in the shadow of the famine. It was inside his bony grip. An estimated 6 to 10 million people died. Now, you could say, well, famines happen. And of course, many of the causes of the famine are indeed induced by some natural climatic movements, like El Nino, which affects the Indian monsoon here. But the thing is that when the famine was happened, and there had been potential famines before, but whenever there was a good guy in charge, well, they would redistribute the food. They would transport crops from one location to another so that not many people died. But when you had a bad governor in place, and this was the case of Lytton, then there was no concern for the local people and how they were. And in fact, in this great famine of 1868, the British were actually exporting food out of the country. They exported 320,000 tons of wheat. So simultaneously with millions of people dying, you have food being exported. Now, that juxtaposition of monumental human suffering and a narrow concern for profits, that's absurd. That's just, and if you're Irish, you also understand the British did something similar with the Great Potato Famine and so on. So the point is that in capitalism, the only concern is growth. The only concern is profit, and human life doesn't matter. And this organizing principle, which India was under the British rule also, is now the global organizing principle. So what was happening, the reason I've chosen India as a case study is because this is what was happening globally. And now globally, we live under that algorithm. And the environment is simply, oddly, weirdly, absurdly, an externality. So as long as we are, the balance sheets of this kind of double spread balance sheet of your industry is nice and happy, nothing else matters. And that's mad. Where's the mandate for that? Where's the mandate for us having all of our economy and all of our decisions based on just profits for a small number of people in city centers? It's not okay. And India is an incredible illustration of how badly things can work out when you don't think more broadly about what growth is, what human development is, and when you're blinkered in or shuttered in to just narrow capitalist priorities.